colleagues, uh, friends and colleagues, let us start the session. Excuse me. I'm sorry. Friends and colleagues, let us start the session. We want to be in time because I would like to have some announcement. And so it would be nice if we can start quickly. Please, the one that sit, please try to fill out the middle first, yeah? The missing middle. All right. First of all, my name is Budi Reso Sudarmo. I'm currently the head of the Indonesia project. There are some announcements that I would like to make. First of all, as some of you might know that the project was established in 1965. So next year we are going to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the project, which is a good news. However, along the way, sadly, we have to see some of our senior formally decided to go out from the project because they decided to retire, although they informally will be still active. And this year is not an exception. We have one senior people, member of the project, decided to retire. And this person has an outstanding academic career, contributes significantly to the project. He is responsible to lift up the status of the project as one of the top center on Indonesia, and he has been playing a key person in linking Indonesian academic and Australian academic, and in several academic international arena, he actually has been representing Indonesia.
Yeah, we started.
The person that decided to retire this year is our own Professor Hal Hill. Hal, on behalf of everybody in Indonesia project, and if I may, on behalf of all the Indonesians in Australia, we would like to thanks for all what you have done to Indonesia project and also Indonesians in Australia. There are several people actually would like to say something in this occasion, but we cannot get all of them, and we only allow 2 of them to say something. But they are quite far from us, so they send something to us for this occasion.
Hi, Hal. First of all, I'd like to wish you happy retirement, well-deserved retirement. I was just trying to recollect when was the first time I met you. It must have been when I was already either in my honors year or when I started doing my master's, when going more often to Coombs building. That's probably when I start knowing you. And of course, through the years, you have done so much work for Indonesia. We have done work on foreign investment, we've done interviews together. I can still recall the interview we did with Poppy Darsono, where you were, in your own words, just very dazzled by her that you forgot to ask questions. If I remember that correctly, when we were doing some work on textiles. And then later on, we did this regional economics study of Indonesia, where we did a study on every province. We were very quite involved with that. And I think that was one of the great major works that we have been able to achieve. I would say my first impression of you was that you were more Javanese than Australian. You are really not representing Australian, but more Javanese. You are someone who I've never seen angry. You always have a smile on your face. And you're always seeing the good side of people. And I think we appreciate that very much from your characteristic. And you have become a bapa, a big brother for many of our researchers, and I hope that you can continue this role after you retire. Certainly have contributed a lot to the understanding of many issues in Indonesia, specifically on foreign investment, on industrialization, not to mention all the wonderful students that you have produced, including our Minister of Finance and many more. I suspect you're going to be more busy than even before you retire. If we can use Professor Heinz Arndt as a good example of someone who was actually much more busy after he retired than when he was still having full-time occupation, then I think you're probably going to go in that route. But hopefully you'll still have more time to relax, spend more time with Glenda and your kids and your grandkids, and spend more time drinking wine, I guess. But at the same time, we certainly hope that you continue working on Indonesia and on regional issues. And I certainly look forward to our continued partnership in many things, whether it's work, whether it's tennis. Yes, I forgot to mention about tennis. That is one of the things I do remember about our past relationship. We used to play tennis regularly. Hal, happy retirement. Wishing you all the best.
As I mentioned, there is another person that would like to say something. Here is the person.
The first time I met Professor Hal Hill was at the ANU back on 1995. I was a student at the Australian National University at that time, and Professor Hal Hill, he helped me when I did my thesis on the political economy of trade protection. And I would recall and I would remember Professor Hal Hill is a very enthusiastic supervisor. He spent uncountable hours to read my chapters, to provide a comment, criticisms, and when I did my PhD from 97 to 2001, Professor Hal Hill was my supervisor. He was the one who introduced me to the academic world, and I will always remember every time I submit my chapter, he will give a prompt comment, and this is typical of Professor Hal Hill. Every time I make an argument, he always asks me about the qualification, and he said that your argument is right, but it's supposed to be juxtaposed against what? And this, makes me become very careful in everything that I stated on my thesis. It really helps me in making, when I'm writing an academic journal, and also it helped me a lot in my career now. Even now, when I have to make a decision, I always make a alternative hypothesis or juxtapose against the decision that I would like to make in order to get an objective result. I know Hal is a very good, is someone who are very knowledgeable about wine, and every time he sent me an email, he kept telling me about what the best wine in Australia. So this is the thing that probably makes life in Canberra is very colorful, beautiful things, wonderful things with Professor Hal. I always remember he always start his email to me with the statement, "Halo, apa kabar, Bung? Apakah ada waktu sedikit? Maaf mengganggu, Bung." It's typical of Professor Hal Hill. Every time he come to Indonesia, we discuss a lot about the economic policy. Even in my position now as the Minister of Finance, he helps me a lot. So I do believe that Professor Hal Hill, he contributes a lot, not only to me, not only for my thesis, but also for Indonesian economy. I cannot think of any other person in economics that contribute to the Indonesian economy as Professor Hal Hill. I also benefited a lot as a student of Professor Hal Hill. Let me give an example. Back on 2011, I was involved on the high-level trade panel chaired by Jagdish Bakwati and Peter Sutherland. And perhaps, I know this is, I keep this a secret, but I would like to tell you now to you, Hal. The first question asked by Jagdish Bakwati to me, he asked me, Dede, I heard that you are a student of Professor Hal Hill. Oh, it means you are safe. You are a good guy. So, I can really use the reputation of the Professor Hal Hill. So, Professor Hal Hill, wishing you all the best for your retirement. It's a big loss for all of us in the sense that maybe formally you will be no longer at the Australian National University, but I do believe that you can continue to contribute to the study and academic work about the Indonesian economy. Now, of course, not only the Indonesian economy, because you are also will be remembered as the one who done a lot of study on Southeast Asian economy. So once again, wishing you all the best for your retirement. Terima kasih.
There's a little bit more how the Indonesia, a little bit more. The Indonesia project would like to give you a small gift. It's certainly not comparable to what you have done for us, and I would like to invite a female member of the project to give it to Hal. Okay. Let me give the floor to Arianto to start the session.
Good morning. Needless to say, we're under time pressure now, but for good reason, I think. My name is Arianto Patunru from Indonesia Project, and it's a pleasure for me to chair this second session on economics update. And we have, of course, distinguished speakers here, Professor Hal Hill, Australian National University, Dr. Haryo Aswicahyono, CSIS in Jakarta, and also for discussion, we have Dr. Susan Olivia, Department of Econometrics from Monash University. Without further ado, I will invite Hal first to give your presentation.
Oh, well, selamat siang, and terima kasih. That's a bit overwhelming, but thank you very much, and welcome to the update, number 32. I guess I was one of the few people who was here at the first update, which was 1983, and it's wonderful to see the series still going. Okay, well, after all that, it's all going to be downhill, from exciting presentations by our wonderful friends to sort of, the gloomy economics. So let's start. I guess time is a little bit tight, Pacho, so we probably have to cut a bit, huh? This is a joint presentation with another one of my victims, Dr. Haryo Aswicahyono from CSIS. And so the victim said, you've got to now be the victim and talk the most. So I'm going to talk, and then Haryo will do the Tanya Jawab, the Q&A. So the first session was a pretty upbeat session, and rightly so. The politics in Indonesia this year has been remarkable. The outcome has been remarkable. And so we're going to be the economists, the sort of the gloomy science of economics, the dismal science, and sort of start worrying a little bit. There are lots of jokes about economists, all these terrible jokes. So what's one of them? Today is a forecast for a beautiful sunny day, but economists warn that the price of sunglasses are going to go up. So we're going to be telling that kind of story. Yeah? It's a story It's a story where there are quite a lot of statistics. So you remember, lies, damn lies and statistics, but don't worry, we're economists, so you can trust us. So don't look at the stats, just listen to us. Huh? The main story is, in fact, the Indonesian economy is at the crossroads. Indonesia has enjoyed a remarkable 14 years since the devastating Asian financial crisis, and it survived the global financial crisis of 2008-9 very well, remarkably well, in fact, better than its neighbours. It's now facing another difficult period. In some ways, this could be the most difficult period after the Asian financial crisis. So that's going to be the theme. The economy is at the crossroads. The principal issue is how Indonesia adjusts, a bit like Australia. For having this once-in-a-century commodity boom, it now has to adjust to a different kind of era where commodity prices are lower. So the drivers of the economy, which were formerly so powerful for the past decade, are now much weaker. So we're going to be probing this question of how Indonesia can adjust to this new era. If it doesn't adjust, it is, I think, as Douglas Ramage nicely put it, it's going to face an era of fairly slow growth and sluggish economy, and living standards which aren't improving very quickly, and poverty which won't fall quickly enough. So I think there are very stark choices for the new administration, and that's how we're going to frame our presentation. So the basic message is threefold. The economy is holding up, but just. It's holding up just. There are various fragilities. Indonesia needs to develop a new growth strategy, and it's going to have to do it in much more difficult global economic times. A lot of uncertainty in the global economy with lower commodity prices and a lot of sort of capital volatility, making the task of our distinguished ANU graduate, Dr. Hatip Basri and Mari Pangestu and others, a much more difficult one. And that's, in the background, is, I guess you would say, a complete disconnect between the political narratives of the parliamentary and the presidential election campaigns of this year and the economic reality. By the way, I'm talking about Indonesia, but I could be talking about Australia, for that matter. Okay, so here's the basic story. The economy, we think, is doing surprisingly well, but for now, there are significant global headwinds. It's now a fairly difficult global economic environment. There's continuing policy drift at home. Policy drift is a polite word for saying inaction. And importantly, the new administration has zero fiscal space. Like all new administrations, it's coming in with an ambitious spending program, and it's got basically zero, or you might even say negative fiscal space to do anything, unless it reforms. And this is also in the context of some somewhat worrying economic fragilities, which we'll talk about in the presentation. And the question, in a way, is what are the new drivers of growth going to be after the commodity era? And a lot of discussion, of course, in Indonesia is saying, well, it's going to be the industrial sector. We're going to have a revitalisation of the manufacturing sector. And we talk a bit about, at the end of the presentation, whether that's possible and what's needed to get there. And then a brief conclusion, time permitting, on the new administration and some of the challenges. Okay, so that's all. We're not going to get through half of that probably, but we'll try and get through some of it at least. Okay, so first of all, on the surface, things look surprisingly good, considering all this. The middle line, just focus on the middle line, and that's the growth rate. You can see the economy is holding up fairly well. It's still growing at 5%. It's enough for the government to rightly claim that Indonesia is the second fastest growing economy in the G20 group of economies of the world, although India is about to overtake it, so it'll become number 3. But it's still holding up fairly well, but it is the slowest growth in the economy since 2008-9, where, as you remember, Indonesia slowed down, but didn't slow down a lot, and it was fairly temporary. These are the stats you can ignore, but the basic story is that what economists call the tradable goods sectors, that is agriculture, mining and manufacturing, are growing pretty slowly, less than 4%, and that's in a sense, that's where the growth is going to have to come from in the future. And you've already got an economy growing at just a bit over 5%, but the so-called tradables growing at about 4%. So a 4% growth economy is not nearly enough for where Indonesia is. Remember, it's still in the lower middle income group of countries. In fact, it's towards the bottom end of the lower middle income group. Mining, of course, has its special problems, and so mining growth has been negative. Agriculture, you can't expect to grow much more than about 3%. That's the long-term historical average. And manufacturing isn't showing signs of the revival which people are hoping for. Manufacturing's growing at a bit over 5% a year. You remember in the Suharto era, it was growing at over 10% a year, almost every year. So this is a significant slowdown by Indonesian standards, also a significant slowdown by East Asian standards. What's holding up the economy so far is actually Indonesian consumers, some of whom maybe are here. Indonesian consumers are still spending, and that in a way the key to the growth resilience at the moment is the fact that Indonesian consumers are spending. If you decompose the growth into different forms of spending, that is consumption, investment, government and trade, it's really the consumption which is keeping going. Investment's slowing down quite a lot. Most of the investment anyway is in the construction sector, which is also a bit fragile. And so that slow investment means that that has implications for slower growth rates in the future, since investment drives the growth in the future. A very interesting statistic also looking at the government sector. We know there's a history of governments tending to sort of spend a lot before during an election year to get re-elected. In fact, if you look at one of the figures, it's the 1.1 figure, the Indonesian government was not spending its way through an election. In fact, it was actually contracting for most of the first half of this year. In a way, that's a sign, I guess, of fiscal prudence. And of course, it's a sign also of a government that a president, of course, didn't have to be re-elected as well. On the trade side, net exports look okay, but what's actually happening is that imports are declining faster than exports are declining. So the trade story also is a challenging one for the government. Now, having put that side of the story, the comparative story is actually pretty good. And so it's always, the question is, in fact, Dede reminded us, it's compared to what? Well, in fact, if you compare Indonesia to perhaps what's sometimes misleadingly called the Fragile Five. This was a term introduced into our lexicons last year. That was Indonesia, India, Turkey, Brazil and South Africa. These are the 5 countries compared with fairly recent statistics. In fact, Indonesia looks very good. It's the fastest growing economy amongst the 5, although India probably is now going to grow faster. Its deficits, the fiscal deficit, the current account deficit, the things that people worry about aren't particularly severe. So Indonesia comparatively looks pretty good. It also looks pretty good by neighbourly standards. In fact, the only country at the moment growing faster than Indonesia in Southeast Asia is unusually the Philippines, which is good for the Philippines, but that in a way is telling us about the much slower growth dynamics in the whole of Southeast Asia. The macro story is fairly stable. This is where non-economists tend to go to sleep, so I won't put you to sleep by talking about it in much detail. But basically the story is Indonesia's been always fairly prudent on, or most of the time fairly prudent on its macro policy. Inflation, which is the green line, is coming down. Remember, it pushed up last year when some of the electricity prices went up, also when you had big wage increases last year, and also the exchange rate depreciated quite a lot. So inflation jumped up temporarily for about 6 months of last year, but it's now come down. So Bank Indonesia is reasonably comfortable with an inflation rate of around, it's in the targeted range for Bank Indonesia, and so inflation is fairly comfortable. And the exchange rate, which is the blue line, has depreciated quite a lot, and that's a good thing for Indonesia. In fact, it's really the most important factor in trying to reorient the economy from this commodities-driven model to something involving more of manufacturing. So you'll see, I'll talk about this in more detail, but you'll see the rupiah declining quite sharply last year, and declined by about 25%, and that is really due to this global volatility, which I'll talk about shortly. And so the red line is the Jakarta Stock Exchange. So for those of you who had money in the Jakarta Stock Exchange last year, you would have lost quite a bit from around about May through to the end of the year, but you've caught up with your money since. So the stock exchange has recovered. Okay, so here's the politics story. These beautiful graphics are Haryo's. I claim no credit for them, and they're really brilliant. Okay, so let's move on to these. First of all, so that's sort of saying things are cautiously okay, but there are some significant question marks. Let's move on to some of the things which are holding back economic development. The first point to note, and there are some international and some domestic. So I'm going to start with the international, then go to some of the domestic. So the key point is that Indonesia is in a very uncertain period of time. Again, some of Haryo's brilliant graphics, and this is as well as being a brilliant graphic, it's actually quite important. What this is telling us is that these two important people, they're Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen. Janet Yellen, of course, is now up in Cairns, North Queensland, with Hatib Basri, in fact, for the G20 meeting. What that's telling us is that these external events, that is the signalling the end of quantitative easing in the US, that is the end of this ultra easy money policy, which has been employed by the US and, of course, by Japan and the EU to try and avert a serious global recession, that rebounds big time on so-called emerging market economies like Indonesia. In fact, there's a big debate going on globally, and it's also going to be going on in Cairns and then the G20 meeting later in Brisbane about should the rich countries of the North, that is US, principally US, Japan and the EU, should they modify their policy settings to take account of the concerns of the poorer countries like Indonesia. In fact, one of the leading spokespersons from the emerging economies market is the very distinguished Indian Reserve Bank Governor, Raghuram Rajam, and he said America has to take account of our needs in setting its own policy. So these are the policies, at first Bernanke in May last year and now Janet Yellen currently, which have been making life difficult for Indonesian policymakers. The brief story is as follows. Indonesian policymakers at the moment, this is economic policymakers, don't really trust international capital markets. First. Secondly, Indonesian economic policymakers don't have control over a lot of policy variables. They essentially control the fiscal deficit, which is set at 3% of GDP by the 2003 fiscal law, and they control the interest rate and by extension the exchange rate. But they don't control a lot else in the economy. Thirdly, Indonesian policymakers in this sort of globally uncertain environment have decided to choose economic stability over economic growth. That's been very clear from the remarks over the past year of Pak Agus, the Bank Indonesia governor, and Pak Dede, the finance minister. They have in mind the bitter experience of 1997-98 when the economy went into free fall. And they also have in mind the experience of after May 2013, when Bernanke first announced the signal of the end of quantitative easing, and a lot of capital left the country. I'll show that some stats in a minute. And so they face this somewhat uncertain global economic environment, and they say, we're going to have slower growth because higher growth they think is too risky. So I'm not justifying their argument, but that's essentially what the argument is. They have memories of 97-98. They fear that if you have larger fiscal deficits, a lot of the big infrastructure projects could possibly create really serious debt problems for the economy in future years because they won't be viable. You know, this is the Jembatan Selat Sunda, you know, the Sunda Strait Bridge, the Jakarta seawall, you know, you name it, lots of them. And they worry about the fact that, and also corporate bailouts, you know, they have to, you know, sort of corporates, you know, they privatise the profits and socialise the losses. So that's the kind of cautious mindset they have. Moreover, they don't have any kind of international financial safety net in the event of a crisis, a balance of payments crisis. You remember the traditional safety net used to be the IMF. The IMF is still politically unacceptable in Indonesia, so that safety net's been removed. and a regional initiative called the Enhanced Chiang Mai Initiative, CMIM, which is supposed to be a regional grouping of countries who will help each other in the event of a crisis, is basically non-functional. So basically, therefore, the government it's got an unusual policy setting. It's targeting the current account deficit. It's saying if it's more than 3% of GDP, we're going to put the brakes on. So that's essentially what happened last year when the current account deficit rose to over 4%, and a lot of capital left the country. Pak Agus and Pak Dede put the brakes on big time. Tight monetary policy and fairly tight fiscal policy let the exchange rate go. So that's the sort of balance of payment story. Indonesia now has a kind of a structural deficit in its balance of payments, and that's mostly because of the oil subsidy, the fuel subsidy and other subsidies, which are creating this deficit on the trade balance, which is unusual in Indonesia's history. So it has a balance of payments problem, and the policymakers also worry about this deficit on the balance of payments being funded by short-term capital, which is highly mobile and can quickly exit the country. This is a kind of complicated graph, but just look at this, at the big drop in July, mid 2013. This figure, this drop above me. That is what's happened after Bernanke made the announcement in May of last year. A lot of short-term capital left the country. And so this is just looking at the various kinds of short-term capital. There's the stock market, that's the Jakarta Stock Exchange principally. There are SUNs, they're the government bonds for funding its deficit, and the Certificate Bank Indonesia, central bank certificates. So a lot of capital left the country very quickly, and if you're a policymaker in the midst of this kind of exodus, you begin to worry, is this a repeat of 1997-98? And therefore they put the brakes on very tight, and that's why the economy is slowing down substantially. In fact, the capital came back, but then there's still this nervousness. Will it exit again when the next statement, this time from Janet Yellen, comes saying we're going to stop quantitative easing? Another reason for the government being cautious and indeed nervous is that already Indonesia pays a significant risk premium when the government borrows. So this is government borrowing. This is supposed to be the safest kind of borrowing. The safest kind of bonds. They're government guaranteed. This actually shows us, this is for 10-year local currency bonds for Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia and Thailand. What you see, Indonesia is the top blue line. Indonesia pays a significant risk premium compared to its neighbours, Philippines, Malaysia and Thailand. It's the order of magnitude is about 4 percentage points. On a large debt, that's a lot of money. And so that's another reason why Indonesian policymakers are very cautious. You'll see, incidentally, that after Bernanke, again, look at the period after May 2013, there was a lot of capital left the country, and the risk premium really shot up quite markedly. Compared notably to Malaysia and Thailand, where there was almost no change, you'd expect that because Malaysia and Thailand have been traditionally pretty prudently managed economies. But it's also noticeable in the case of the Philippines, the green line, that also didn't increase markedly. So that's another reason why Indonesian policymakers are particularly cautious at the moment. A second headwind, the first global headwind is this capital volatility. The second one is, as we know, commodity prices have been declining. This just shows the prices for a few key commodities for Indonesian exports. The most important, of course, now are coal and palm oil, also gas to some extent. They have fallen quite a bit since around 2011. That's the end of the commodity boom. The figures are the decreases are probably greater than those figures suggest. Palm oil, for example, I think has now fallen about 35 or 40% since its peak. Coal prices, as we know in Australia, also declining quite a bit. And so this is the end of the sort of once-in-a-century commodity boom, and it's very unlikely these prices are going to come back. So that's a second global headwind. It's worth making the point, however, that prices are still fairly buoyant by historical standards. So it's not as though it's the 1980s story when Indonesia experienced a catastrophic collapse in commodity prices, but it is putting pressure on the economy. It's also putting pressure on government revenue as well. So that's the global story. What about the domestic story? Well, there are a few points to emphasise here as well, which are making life a bit more difficult, again, for the new administration. Indonesia had these very large minimum wage increases last year, as we know. In a way, I mean, of course, it's understandable. It was an election year, but it was, in some ways, perhaps the worst time to have a big wage increase. The orders of magnitude, 40, 50% in the minimum wage. This is at a time when the terms of trade are falling, that is, commodity prices, what Indonesia gets for its exports are declining. And it's a time when capital markets are nervous and therefore they're tending to exit on the sign of, small events. So the wage increases were pretty big last year and they're feeding through, of course, this year. The sharpest increase, in fact, of course, is Jakarta. The other provinces don't look as bad, but in fact, these are set at Kabupaten, sub-provincial level. And so the Kabupaten, as Chris Manning has reminded us recently, the Kabupaten around Greater Jakarta, in fact, have gone up like Jakarta. And that's really making Indonesian competitiveness a problem for especially its traditional labour-intensive exports, the garments and the footwear and things like that. It also meant that the exchange rate depreciation of last year, which was supposed to boost the competitiveness of the economy, has been nullified quite a lot in those firms which have to pay these very large wage increases. And of course the wage increases come on top of particularly restrictive severance pay requirements, so firms wanting to relocate, say, from Jakarta to Central Java, where minimum wages are much lower, find it's pretty difficult to do that because they've got to actually close down the operations, pay these very large severance payments, and then try and operate in Central Java, where they kind of get stuck in another problem, which is Indonesia's serious infrastructure deficit. So that's number one, a domestic issue. Number two is, it's been talked about already, is the subsidies. This is just a very brief summary of the fiscal position of the government's currently in. This is basically 2013 budget, the final figures, 2014, the current year estimated, and 2015, what President Yudhoyono proposed to be the budget in his Independence Day speech. If you look at the expenditure side, you quickly realise that Indonesia the government has no room to move on fiscal policy without reform. Just look at the expenditure figures for 2015. This is the proposed budget for the incoming administration. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, President Yudhoyono. This is a tough budget. I'm sure Pak Jokowi is saying. So look at the numbers, and there's lots and lots of zeros in them. I forget how many zeros there are actually, but just think of the expenditure figure being 2. It's 2,000 trillion or something, isn't it? I forget how many zeros. It's 2. Then you look at the subsidies. That's mainly the fuel subsidies, but electricity and other things, they're actually 0.6. So out of 2, 0.6 goes straight away into these subsidies. They don't make sense on equity grounds, on efficiency grounds, also on environmental grounds. So 0.6 goes on the subsidies. 0.43, sorry, wrong number. The 0.6 goes to the Kabupaten, it's the dana alokasi umum, the automatic transfers of dana alokasi khusus. That's the 0.6. So subsidies and the regions get over half the total budget. Then you've got personnel material. You can't really do much there quickly. You've got that's basically the civil service salary. Not a lot of room for movement there. And so that's another 0.5. And so then you've got the rest, the 0.4. And that's got to really meet all these other new commitments, whether it's health, whether it's social security, whether it's infrastructure, and whether it's defence, for example, too. So the government has basically no room to move. The fiscal deficit, 2.3% of GDP. It's probably a bit more than that, but I think it's very close to the 3%, which is the fiscal law limit. So essentially, without subsidies, this new administration has no room to move. That's why, in a sense, as the speakers in the politics session this morning mentioned, it looks like the rhetoric from Pak Jokowi is very positive. In fact, the hoped-for deal in late Bali, the summit between Pak SBY and Pak Jokowi. Looked like it might have even done a joint bipartisan deal. That didn't work. And so we're back to Pak Jokowi, I guess. Another issue which we have to worry about a little bit is there is a bit of now creeping financial fragility in the banking sector. This is also related indirectly to this global economic volatility. When capital started leaving Indonesia last year after Menanke, Pak Agus, the central bank governor, with a lag of about 3 months, there was a bit of indecision between BI and finance for a while, but Pak Agus instituted fairly tight monetary policy, pushed up the Bank Indonesia rate, as I showed you earlier, by about 1.75 percentage points. That's actually meant that some of the banks now are actually on the edge of their limits. And you see this from looking at the loan to deposit ratios. It's for some banks already they're over 100%, which obviously they can't continue an operation like that. So that's putting pressure on the banking sector. It's in addition putting pressure on the banking sector because you have yet no domestic financial safety net. The bill which enables the safety net to operate, a thing called the JPSK, Jaring Pengaman System Keuangan, hasn't yet been passed by the DPR. And that's the enabling legislation for government officials to actually run a bank bailout operation, should there be another bank century. And in a way, the shadow of Bank Century is looming over the government. As one senior official put it, if there's another bank collapse like Bank Century, I'll send them to the KPK. And that's because no one will sign off on a rescue package because, as we know, very sadly, the current Vice President, Pak Budiono, and the former Finance Minister, Ibu Sri Mulyani, people of the highest calibre and personal integrity, rescued Bank Century sensibly because it looked like if one bank goes, another one might go, another one might go. No one will do that again. So there is this financial fragility which is a challenge. That's also partly because, and that reflects also some uncertainty in the foreign exchange market, which is the gap between the official rate and what's sometimes called the expected rate or the forward rate. I'll skip that, but that's another element of the of the nervousness in the capital market. Okay, so then we get back to also on the domestic policy regime of economic nationalism. Been discussed quite a lot. We haven't got a lot to say that's new, but of course the campaign rhetoric, as the previous speakers mentioned, was very powerful. It's going to be very hard to turn around. You want to finance your deficits, but you're sort of telling foreigners we don't really want your money. So there's a challenge there for the new administration. The trade law of last year, the industry law of last year, very inward-looking, regulatory protectionist. There's been a bit more of that coming up this year. For example, the bill on plantations to limit the cap of ownership to 30% from the current 90%. That's another part of it. Incidentally, the most affected investors will be Malaysian investors. They're the major investors in Indonesian plantation, foreign investors. And the ASEAN Economic Community comes into force next December next year, and there's supposed to be a seamless Southeast Asian economy. So it can't really be seamless when you're running these kind of policies. The mining deal looks like being sorted out. Freeport is sorted and Newmont will be sorted out, but that's at a cost to Indonesia, a considerable cost to Indonesia as well. Okay, so can Indonesia chart a new strategy after the commodity boom? Well, I'm running out of time. Just a few quick stats. The manufacturing hasn't been growing particularly fast. It's about 5%, 6%. That's about half what it used to be for quite a long time. Importantly, the traditional manufactured exports haven't been doing particularly well. Indonesia's been losing share in garments. Countries like Bangladesh, even Cambodia and Vietnam doing better. It's also been missing out somewhat on what's the biggest part of regional trade, this so-called global production networks, principally electronics, also the automotive industry. It's now about half of Southeast Asian, intra-Southeast Asian trade, and also about half of East Asian trade. Indonesia is still missing out on a lot of that trade, and it shouldn't be missing out. There's no reason why it should. In a sense, it's the policy regime which is holding back participation in it. A very fine PhD done at the ANU 2 years ago by Mukti Suyatman. The title was, "Why is Indonesia Missing Out on Global Production Networks?" So if there's going to be a turnaround with this new growth strategy, these are the kind of sectors that are going to have to grow faster, and they could easily grow faster with a bit of reform. Okay, I'll skip some of this story, but just to say there's no real evidence yet of this manufacturing turnaround. So what's needed to turn the economy around? Well, it's very well known. We haven't got time to discuss it. The exchange rate currently is moving in the right direction, but almost everything else hasn't yet moved. So whether it's infrastructure, whether it's the labour market, populism and the skills which are required for this high productivity with higher wages, whether it's the investment climate, foreign and domestic, they haven't yet shown clear signs of movement. Of course, there's lots of important initiatives within the government, so there's some very hopeful signs. I think the senior policy officials know exactly what to do, and in a way that's the optimistic note, that Indonesian policymakers know what to do. The question is, will the new administration give them the space to be able to do it? So these are just various indicators. I'll skip them, and I'll skip this one as well, since that'll take about half an hour to explain. Okay, summing up. So Indonesia is at the crossroads. It's doing surprisingly well. And so I don't want to convey the impression that a crisis is imminent. It's certainly not imminent. The question is Indonesia headed for a high-growth, prosperous future with rapid reductions in poverty, or is it headed towards a much slower growth future where poverty doesn't really decline much, if at all? In some ways, the Indonesian economy now reminds those of us of a certain age of the early 1980s. Remember, Indonesia had a big commodity boom in the 70s. And then as commodity prices began to fade in the early 1980s, there were the beginnings of reform. That was the old days of the Berkeley Mafia, and they knew how to reform the economy then. They depreciated the exchange rate, they ran fairly tight fiscal and monetary policy in the early 1980s, but at that time there was still the build-up, the head of steam from the economic nationalism of the 70s. There were the big state enterprises going, there was technology policy, there were lots of restrictive investment and trade policies, and so all that 70s story was going in the other direction. And then it took the mid-1980s, when commodity prices really collapsed, the oil prices halved in late 1985, early 86, for the economists to persuade President Suharto that there had to be big-time reform. Now, that story has been beautifully written up by our dear late friend Hadi Susastro, and that was a period when Indonesia avoided the debt crisis that almost all other major developing country commodity exporters experienced. The question now is what's going to be the trigger? So Indonesia now is very like what it was in 1982, when you had this first round of macro reforms, but you had no micro reform. So the question in my mind is what's going to be the trigger for the second round of these bold micro reforms which are needed, the kinds of things we've discussed. So far the narratives aren't particularly encouraging. As previous speakers mentioned, however, the fact that Pak Jokowi's been pushing very hard on this subsidy reform issue, perhaps that's encouraging. So looking forward, what do we know? I'm almost finished, but what do we know? Well, first of all, what do we have to look at? Well, first of all, the subsidy reform, that's the absolute essential one. Also enhanced tax effort. Indonesia doesn't really collect enough tax and it could collect more. Second point is the key cabinet appointments. Well, mudah-mudahan, our two distinguished friends above, maybe they'll get back in the next cabinet. But the choice of cabinet minister is really important. The coordinating economics minister, the finance minister, and also ensuring that Bank Indonesia retains its independence. Third obvious point is working with the new parliament. Then we need to see clear signs of progress on a few key areas. And by progress, I guess we mean not grand rhetoric, but plans that are going to work. So the subsidies, the regulatory reform, the infrastructure, and winding back the excesses of the economic nationalism, which has got a real head of steam, and some of the labour market issues as well. If not, this is the kind of worry in the background. This is our friend Monsieur Piketty. The most widely discussed economics book this year, I forget the title of it actually, The Age of Inequality or something. Indonesia's had this very unusual experience in the past decade. Inequality has risen sharply. It's risen, the Gini ratio, which economists use to measure inequality, has risen by almost 10 percentage points. And so you've got in the background, you've got this combination of slowing growth and rising inequality, which is going to create a really big challenge for the new administration unless there's reform. There'll be a session on this tomorrow. Chris Manning will talk about it, but in the background, this is quite a serious issue for the government as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pak Hal. Over to Susan.
Okay, first of all, let me start by first thanking ANU Indonesian Update for inviting me to be discussant for this economic update. And it's really a privilege and it's a pleasure for me to be back to Canberra again. And then although I have to admit, when the first time I visited Canberra, that was back in 2008, I think Pak Hal organized the Development Economics Workshop, I did say that I'm not going to coming back to Canberra again. Right? Because I think that the perception of mine about what the capital of developed country is not meet my expectation. When I arrived at the old Canberra airport, it's pretty much not much better to the situation airport back in my hometown in Medan, which was kind of like a chaotic warehouse with nothing, But then I think I have the opportunity to get to meet the Indonesian ANU mafia, and then among notable Pak Hal, Pak Chris, Pak Buji, and then I think also that the president of ANU and Indonesia project have done substantial work in the Indonesian economy, and then such this annual event of Indonesian Update that make me something to look forward to coming back to Canberra again. Secondly, I would like to thank Pak Hal and Pak Haryo on wonderful work on the economic survey, and then a very wonderful presentation. And then probably my job as a discussant, I'm probably just going to give a few comments, and then hopefully that kind of stimulate some discussion later on here. So let me start to begin with talking. I'm not going to touch a lot of areas because if I'm going to talk about the whole thing, it's going to take forever. So it's going to touch on a few things in here. So the first thing, try to look at the macroeconomic development, right? So Indonesia, like Pak Hal mentioned, that seems to weather the emerging market turmoil pretty good, right? So Indonesia, if you know that back in last year, Indonesia get the title of the fragile five, right? But again, that despite the growth slipped to the 5-year low, did not suffer the similar slump as in other emerging markets when the Fed went ahead with a moderate taper, right? So I think when Pak Hal mentioned that this Ben Bernanke announced that we are going to put a more economic stimulus, all these emerging markets went kabao, right? But then I think again, probably there's kind of term Indonesia tend to coming up with a good policy in the bad times, and then that kind of be safe, coming backtrack Indonesia achieving economic growth, although that is not that quite as high as before, but I think we are still growing in here. I mean, looks like from a Pak Hal explanation that kind of part of the economic plan, how we're going to get this economic stability. And then the other thing is that the state of current account, I think the state of current account that we are not going to get that positive surplus current account because by default that the deficit is unavoidable because of this the rise of Indonesia scooter class. So I think last summer that's quite been nicely quoted by MD Sumner because the reason that Indonesia has such a huge demographic dividend, and then we have an abundance of labor force in the population, and then most of these people they are in the early 20s and 30s, right? Of course, they cannot afford to buy Mercedes-Benz or BMW yet, so they're probably going to start with buying a scooter, and then probably I think if you look at the statistics, that the growth of this scooter probably is the highest in the developing country, right? So I guess one of the way is going to do it is how we're going to deal with this current account deficit in here. And then we saw that the taper tantrum is going to creating a big chaos in the emerging market in here, right? So just by the announcement is last year, and then earlier this year that the Janet Yellen decided when to go ahead with this taper tantrum, and that Indonesia thankfully survived from that. And then, but how about that? Are we ready if there's a taper tantrum version number 2.0? Especially if it happened sooner than expected. And then because, what happened before, talking about Indonesian politics being settled, and then market sentiments with Jokowi being elected as president, giving this pouring money into the country, and then are we ready to experience that 2.0 here? And then another problem is here is that one sector pain is another gain, right? So I mean that weaker commodity price, because Indonesia has been relying on this commodity boom, right? So maybe that this kind of is a blessing in disguise. So making kind of like give a wake-up call for Indonesia. Is at the time to diversify economy from agricultural sectors based probably to more like manufacturing and industrial based in here, right? And then probably again, and then this opportunity, like what happened also in other global economy, right? So the slowing down of the China economy, and then the rising wage in China, and of course the producer, they try to look outward from China, right? So in the past, when I was young, I tend to like one of my relatives, when they went abroad, they always like came brought souvenir and they say, oh, this made in Indonesia, right? I mean, I'm very proud because like, made in Indonesia good like made to the global market. But how come like these days, we hardly like see made in Indonesia product anymore, right? So dominated by China, but then like, you know, Vietnam like seems to be able to like take advantage of this, so what happening in China. So why Indonesia? Indonesia has the potential to do that, right? So I think like everything come up with that, we need like structural changes to do that, right? And then I think like in the paper that Hal did mention about this revival of manufacturing growth, and then something like manufacturing growth is not doing very well. So Indomie, so I will start with here. And looks like, so made in Indonesia product is giving like less dominance in the global market, but the Indomie, I'm pretty sure that how many of you like haven't heard about Indomie or had Indomie before? Probably most of you had Indomie before, right? How come that the manufacturing sector, mainly in the food industry, Indomie like tend to be like dominated the global market, right? So when I first went to the US to do my PhD, I couldn't find Indomie. Every time when I went back pulang kampung to Medan, and then I would have to like stock up the Indomie, and then my brother teased me, and then, are you going to open a pop shop in the Davis? Right, but now that when I went back to the US, like it's very easy to find Indomie, even though at the grocery store, like even if you in Canberra go to like Safeway or Coles, you can easily find Indomie here. So why is that like Indomie is doing very well, but not in other sector like a garment industry? Is that because that, I don't know, kind of this Piketty effect? Because is Indomie like started by this Salim group? So because I know kind of this distribution of wealth, so that the rich are getting richer, and then those guy in the middle, the smaller one, they get squeezed, and then they lost that competitive advantage. So I don't know, probably like Hal and Haryo might be able to give us some more insight detailing here, right? So I think that as an Indonesian, I mean, although like I know a lot of people like kind of a bit pessimistic, but I'm hopeful that Indonesia has the potential to rise and become a more prosperous and equitable, right? And then hopefully that this can only be done if there is good policy, not only in bad times, but also like during good times, so such that they can sustain economic growth and then make that this growth being distributed evenly across the country, right? And then to achieve that, you really need to sustain a high growth and job creation. I think that the job creation is something that's not really quite mentioned in the presentation in here. I'm an economist, I'm trained as a quantitative. I really like to see something about empirical evidence, especially that if you like try to look at this first year macro, people are talking about this Orgon's law. So Orgon's law probably try to look at the relationship between unemployment and economic growth. So they believe that if you want to promote economic growth, you need to create employment, because unemployment and growth, and then they kind of like seem intertwined, right? So if you have a high unemployment, that means that your economy is not growing. And then if your economy is not growing, that means that you have a high unemployment level in here. And it seems that when I try to like find some evidence, what is the response for this growth and unemployment, I couldn't find any for Indonesia, but probably that you might correct me of that one. And then if we have any like, honor student in the audience, you still need to shop around for the topic, so this might be quite a good one topic for you to investigate in here. And then I think like, we all agree that there's kind of be like, we need to do like structural adjustment. We have a lot of favorable domestic factors. So one is that demographic dividend, right? So we have like massive like young population, probably by this demographic transition, probably in like 15, 20 years from now, we can like tap into the opportunity here. So of course that we really need to come up with a good labor policy in order to mobilize this labor force to make sure that they are ready for entering this 21st globalization market in here, right? So not only like access to education, I think that the past government in Indonesia are talking about like giving access to education, right? Primary access, but they're generally talking about this quality of education, right? So I think that quality of education, that during my parents' time, I think when I ask my parents, friends, most of them they tend to become entrepreneurial. They are doing their own business. But at these days, when I ask my friend, none of them that seems to be that the risk taker enough to like do your own business. That partly because that we have this credit constraint, just like probably Piketty effect, right? Only that those group from a rich kid, they are be able to like start their own business, right? So I mean, kind of in the way that you want to like make sure that this social disadvantage is not exist, and then hopefully that might be like some properties on the policy we might be able to tackle that in here. And then the other issue is that rapid urbanization, right? So I mean, I'm from Medan. A lot of like flow of my friends, they are going to like Jakarta, and then some of them Surabaya. And then this urbanization problem is good because urbanization can promote economic growth. But of course, to do this, we have to know to have this present adequate infrastructure for urbanization, and how we're going to like financing these issues to support growth in here, right? So I think infrastructure is very important because you want to have this connection so that then all that people in the rural area, they can also like try to be integral part of economy in here. And then a policy spending issue, the fuel subsidy again and again and again. So I have been to Indonesia update for probably at least my 4th time, and then never in one time I feel subsidy never like came across on the table, right? So I mean again that these like quality of spending matters. If we want to like have a high growth, with quality of spending matter, and then we also like need to take into account what is the quality of growth in here. And I think probably to conclude in here, right, Indonesia really needs reform to perform. Otherwise, this attack of a fragile fight might stick to it a while longer. But the thing is here, I think that Indonesian is very smart enough. We all have the technocrats, they know that what they should be doing. But the challenge is the implementation, especially is that when with the political economy combined, this coalition structure, you are not really sure that how you're going to like make all different parties to like come together, even though they know that we need to do something to make sure that Indonesia can achieve the road to prosperity, climb to the middle, from middle income position to the high income state, right? So then hopefully that, just to conclude in here, that is a bit dividing, so like political party like number 1 and number 2, and then like Jokowi, and then there might be like some speculation that coalition is that belong to the group number 1, they might do something to temper economic growth. And hopefully that whatever the difference is here, hopefully these two parties, they come to realize that, come to the consensus that we need like something good, something supporting each other policy in order to ensure the prosperity for economic Indonesia. I think let me just stop there.
Thank you, Susan. May I invite the first 3 questions? So Yogi, and there's another one here, Raga. Yeah. Oh, Raghav, you can go first because you have the mic.
Hello, yeah. Thanks very much, Hal, for an excellent overview of the Indonesian economy. I know nothing about it, but I'll try to give my 2 cents worth, which when you round it off is 0. Anyway, so the one point that struck me you talked a lot about stabilizing the economy rather than pursuing growth. But one point that struck me quite strongly in your presentation was that the subsidies were 40% of public expenditure, and you had about 0.4 and 2, and so no, 20%, sorry, 20%, 1/5, 20% of public expenditure, which is the same as the amount of money that you had left over for other things. And at the same time, you had another graph where you showed that the loans to deposit ratio has grown quite a lot. Now, so my question is really that maybe the absence of a strong slowdown in the Indonesian economy could be traced to the fact that the banks were being persuaded somehow to keep lending more and more. One of the important facets of the global financial crisis was that there was a huge credit squeeze in all parts of the world. The fact that your loans were growing so fast, even during the global financial crisis, means that there was no credit squeeze in Indonesia. Okay, and now that is now translating itself, given the high burden of subsidies, into non-performing assets of a very high magnitude for the Indonesian economy. That is something to worry about. I think you don't just have a fiscal problem to worry about, you have a bank balance sheet problem to worry about, and the two are linked together. So I think that it might be worthwhile to explore that issue a little bit and, in order to really substantiate the stability in the economy.
Thank you, Raghav. Can you pass the mic to Yogi, please? Yogi here. And another, in the back.
Thank you.
Yes, Yogi.
I actually have 5 questions, but I'm only going to ask one. Yeah, and I will email the rest later. Okay. I guess the difficulty is to find which one is my favorite one, but probably I would like to ask about this wage increase in Jakarta. I guess the question is, you are talking about this wage increase when the commodity price is down, but the figure that you are showing about the commodity price is the more on the mining commodity price, which probably doesn't have any relation with the minimum wage in Jakarta. And so how you are connecting these two into one, and again, regarding this inequality, where this minimum wage in Jakarta stack up in the Kuznets curve. Thank you.
Thank you, Yogi. Alpha. Yogi, can you give the mic to Alpha?
Just quick.
Can you stand up, please?
Okay.
Thank you.
Just quick question about food self-sufficiency, Professor, because I know
speak
that
up?
I know that Jokowi in media say that we will have food self-sufficiency in 3 years, and with the zero space in budget, and Bu Susan also said there is opportunity for regain in manufacturers. How this Jokowi hope to have food self-sufficiency in 3 years affect these manufacturing sectors, and also how the budget will accommodate this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alpha. Can I give Haryo? Yeah. You can use the mic. Yeah.
I would like to answer the first question about stabilization rather than growth and the situation of financial sectors, right? I think it is fragile, but not really, really fragile. Yeah, yeah, you know, because first, the financial sector learned from 1998 crisis, and it's becoming more prudent now compared to before 98. So that's the first. And the second is, I think there is no asset bubble in Indonesia currently. Yes, the price of real estate increased very fast, but it's only in the upper class, in the upmarket. Yeah. In Jakarta, the demand for housing is still in the backlog. So there is no. And the third is maybe the reason for the rising loan to deposit ratio is also because of crowding out for the deposit, crowding out of deposit because of the bond from government give a higher interest rate. So that's maybe the 3 reason why loan deposit ratio increased, but not that fragile. But just a little fragile. About wage increase, I think it's not only mining. You want to say that to connect between wage increase and the decline of commodity boom, right? The commodity is not only mining, and mining is big, especially coal. The second big export commodity is palm oil and rubber, and both are declining very fast. So I think it's two bad things happen at the same time. Increase in the
Maybe we can discuss later on. You can move. Yeah.
wage increase affect every region because Jakarta become the standard for other region. So if Jakarta wage increase, other region look to Jakarta. So the rate usually almost the same, except for several regions where they really commit to compete with Jakarta, like Jawa Tengah. They say that it's good that Jakarta increase their wage so that the investment will go to Jawa Tengah, something like that. So maybe that's the answer for your question. About the self-sufficiency, I think we have to clarify the difference between self-sufficiency and food security. We don't have to be self-sufficient to be self-secure. The key is to secure import. The obsession of self-sufficiency is old in Indonesia, but gained momentum during 2008 food crisis, yeah, in which the price of food increased and countries start to stop or put quota on their export. So we worry that we cannot import rice, for example. So that's the beginning of obsession on self-sufficiency. But we have to think more carefully about this and go to the concept of food security, in which we produce the thing that we have a comparative advantage and import even food that we don't have comparative advantage, like soybean, maybe.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe Pak Hal should answer.
Okay, let's have the second round. In the back, there's one in the back, and two here, yeah, in the middle. Ibu, Hasni, Titi, yeah.
Thank you. Titik Anas, former student of Hal, from Presisi, Indonesia. I'd like to raise an issue or kind of a quick win, given the constraints and the problems that the new government is facing. Of course, growth is based on your comparative advantage, your endowment. I believe that Indonesia, data shows that Indonesia is endowed with the natural resources and also cultural diversity and human resources. Olivia said that we have demography bonus, right? And we have young population. So I would think that a creative economy, of which that the new president is going to have a specific ministry for that, is probably going to be a quick win for Indonesia, because it is based on human resources, and because it's based on culture, arts and culture, as well as natural resources. So for diversification, for example, export diversification, so this has to be taken into consideration. I'm wondering how see this. Thank you.
Thank you, Titi. Ibu.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry for my voice. Pak Hal Hill mentioned that the Indonesian economy now is just holding up. And my question is, one of the programs that Jokowi mentioned in his campaign is that the subsidy for poor family of $100 or $150 per family, and also with the priority of Kartu Sehat and Indonesia Pintar, can the Jokowi government deliver this? And I was wondering whether the subsidy for the poor of 100 and 150 is also a kind of a vote buying in his campaign. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibu Hasnani.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Hasnani Rangkuti. I'm a PhD student from Harvard School of Public Policy. I have actually one quick question, but before that, I'd like to inform Mbak Susan. Actually, we share the same hometown, but right now, Sumatera Utara has the best airport across the nation. Yeah, it's quite fancy, have high tech, and also we have trains, so you must be proud of about not Sumatra. I have a quick question, actually. Do you have any thought, Pak, regarding the economic performance at the level of kabupaten or province, or perhaps like quick thought about that based on the latest situation? Because I found that even though Greater Jakarta remains, the leading, economic in Indonesia, but I found that from my thesis, migrants actually have kind of like new destination from them. They have. I found there's a new geography of migration, which in East Kalimantan, also in Riau. So I'm wondering about the economic inequality, perhaps.
Thank you, Hasnia. As you all know, this has live streaming, so we have one question from Jakarta. This is from Wildan from FAUI, Department of Economics, University of Indonesia. His question is, Jokowi plans to build tol laut, marine transport infrastructure. Is this the kind of tol laut, marine tol? Is this the kind of infrastructure development that Indonesia needs? So over to you, Pak.
About creative economy, the question by Titi Anas. Yeah. I think, yes, creative economy has the potential, but still a long way to go. First, because it cannot be deployed like manufacturing that absorb a lot of labor and create more value added. Creative economy also not yet the source of export that can help the balance of payment. So the key still improving the manufacturing sectors and together with creative economy. The third challenge for creative economy is to link it with the world. Yeah? So it's not only supplying domestic market, but like high quality garment, design. So there are still a lot to do to develop the creative economy. Yes, it is source of creativity, source of diversification, and you need a good minister, said Hal. like Madi. And subsidy for poor family, maybe there will be discussed more by Pak Faisal Basri later on and Chris Manning. But I can only comment about Kartu Sehat and Kartu Pintar. Maybe the main obstacle is the fiscal space. Yeah? How can they finance? How can Jokowi finance those two programs? And about the poor family subsidy, maybe we have two kinds, yeah? Permanent subsidy and the temporary subsidy. I think the only subsidy is the temporary subsidy now. I don't know about the all-the-time subsidy. And the way to go is to make it automatic. It means that if inflation reach a certain level, then automatically you have the food security, safety net, food safety net for the poor. So I think that kind of mechanism that can help the helping poor people not politicized by having a automatic subsidy. For infrastructure toll out, for regional maybe later on Hal Hill will answer that because I know nothing about regional. On toll out, it is not infrastructure actually, it is a system and building the port. The problem with toll out is imbalances between supply and demand between East Indonesia and West Indonesia. So the ship that goes to Makassar is full, but when they return, the ship is empty. So the cost is still high. So Indonesia is a really logistic nightmare in that case. Because whatever you do, you can do it cheaply because of the imbalances of the supply and demand between East and West Indonesia. I think that's my answer on toll out and the regional.
Terima kasih, Bu. Yeah, so this was the topic for the update last year, yeah? So I can give you a complete summary. The book came out, it's 460 halaman, 460 pages, so I can give you a complete summary now. But the bottom line is, the regional record actually, so Big Bang decentralization in 2001, Indonesia, the world's largest archipelagic state. And the story actually is surprisingly good, I think, in the sense that, although it was introduced, the autonomy area was introduced very hastily, it sort of worked, and we haven't seen any increase in inter-regional inequality. Unlike the interpersonal, the Piketty story of increasing interpersonal inequality, the inter-regional inequality, which was shown, in fact, Yogi here in the audience is the world expert on it, and there's been virtually no increase, right, Yogi? It's been very stable. But of course, with the caveats that if the lagging regions, some of them are still not only poor, but lagging still. So you've still got the east-west divide. And the ones which are doing well, Jakarta, which is, it's higher income and growing faster, that's question mark, what's driving it. And the other one doing very well makes Haryo very happy. It's East Java, Dia Orang Surabaya.
Okay, thank you, Pak Hal. We have an important announcement from Marcus, but before that, please join me in thanking the speakers. Thank you.